Think you know what cruelty looks like? Think medieval torture was the worst humanity had to offer? Well, prepare yourself for the Abbasid Caliphate's most refined art form, human flaying, performed with such surgical precision that victims remained conscious for up to 6 hours while their skin was methodically peeled away like fruit. In 9th century Baghdad, executioner Abu Yusuf al-Jarrahi wasn't just a killer. He was an artist. The Caliphate had elevated human skinning to such a sophisticated level that executioners underwent years of training, studying human anatomy with the same dedication as physicians. Al-Jarrahi could remove a man's skin in one continuous piece, starting from the scalp and working downward, ensuring the victim remained fully aware throughout the entire process. The technique required incredible skill. Too fast, and the victim would die from shock, ending their suffering prematurely. Too slow, and blood loss would kill them before the psychological impact was achieved. Al-Jarrahi had perfected the timing. He would make shallow, precise cuts around the hairline, then carefully separate the skin from the muscle tissue underneath. The victim would feel every millimeter of their flesh being peeled away. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The caliphs didn't just want their enemies to die. They wanted them to watch their own skin being removed. Special restraints were designed to keep victims' heads immobilized, forcing them to observe as their flesh was methodically stripped away. Mirrors were positioned strategically so they couldn't avoid seeing their own mutilation. The most disturbing part wasn't the physical agony. It was the psychological torture of watching your own body disappear layer by layer. Victims would beg for death within the first hour, but the executioners were trained to keep them alive and conscious for as long as possible. Some historical accounts describe victims trying to bargain with their executioners, offering information, treasure, anything to make the horror stop. Al-Jarrahi kept detailed notes about his techniques, treating each execution like a scientific experiment. He documented how different cuts affected blood flow, which areas of the body could be skinned without causing immediate death, and how to manipulate the victim's psychology to maximize their terror. These notes weren't hidden away. They were studied by other executioners throughout the Caliphate as instruction manuals. But wait, it gets worse. The skinning wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating something useful from human suffering. What happened to all that carefully removed human skin? The Abbasid caliphs had found the perfect use for it. Human leather became the ultimate symbol of power, transformed into official documents, book bindings, and diplomatic gifts that carried a message no one could ignore. The process of turning human skin into usable leather required the same attention to detail as the skinning itself. Court tanners, working in specialized chambers beneath the caliph's palace, would receive the fresh skin within hours of removal. The flesh had to be processed immediately, or it would become unusable. These tanners weren't ordinary craftsmen. They were artists of horror, trained to transform human suffering into lasting reminders of the caliph's power. The tanning process took weeks. Human skin is thinner than animal hide, requiring delicate chemical treatments to prevent tearing. The tanners would stretch the skin on specially designed frames, treating it with a mixture of tree bark, animal urine, and crushed insects. The smell was so overwhelming that the tanning chambers had to be located far from the main palace, connected only by underground tunnels. Caliph al-Mu'tamid took this practice to unprecedented extremes. He ordered that all death sentences and major legal documents be written on the skin of criminals who had committed similar crimes. Tax evaders' skin became tax collection notices. Thieves' skin was turned into property deeds. Traitors' skin became loyalty oaths that other nobles were forced to sign. But the most chilling use was diplomatic. When neighboring kingdoms displeased the caliph, he would send official correspondence written on human leather. The recipient would immediately understand the message. This wasn't just a letter. It was a person who had crossed the Abbasid Caliphate, transformed into a warning that could be touched, smelled, and forever remembered. The scribes who wrote on human parchment developed specialized techniques for working with the unusual material. Human skin has a different texture than animal hide, requiring specific inks and writing instruments. These scribes became experts at identifying which part of the body their parchment came from based on skin thickness and texture. Scalp skin was preferred for important documents because of its durability. One documented case from 847 CE describes a peace treaty between the Abbasids and the Byzantine Empire, written entirely on human leather. The Byzantine ambassadors were so horrified that several became physically ill during the signing ceremony. But they signed anyway, because refusing would have meant war with an empire that clearly had no limits to its cruelty. The most grotesque detail. The caliphs kept detailed records of whose skin was used for which document. Royal libraries contained catalogs listing the name of the executed person, their crime, and what legal document their skin had become. Some documents were even signed by the victim before their execution, creating a macabre record of a person consenting to become parchment. But the horror of human leather was just the beginning. The caliphs had found an even more disturbing way to ensure their victims' families would never forget their fate. The Abbasid caliphs understood that true terror required an audience. Public executions were common throughout history, but what happened in the flaying chambers of Baghdad went far beyond public spectacle. This was psychological warfare designed to destroy not just the condemned, but everyone who loved them. When a sentence of flaying was pronounced, the condemned person's entire family was required to attend. Not invited, required. Children as young as 5 years old were dragged from their homes and forced to watch their father or mother being skinned alive. The caliphs believed that witnessing such horror would ensure absolute loyalty from the surviving family members and serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider defying the state. The viewing area was designed specifically for maximum psychological impact. Family members were positioned close enough to hear every scream, every plea for mercy, but far enough away that they couldn't offer any comfort to their dying relative. They were chained in place to prevent them from looking away or attempting to intervene. Guards would force their heads up whenever they tried to close their eyes or turn away. Historical records from the court of Caliph al-Mutawakkil describe the systematic destruction of entire bloodlines through forced witnessing. In 861 CE, a minor noble named Ibrahim al-Tabari was condemned for questioning a tax policy. His execution became a masterpiece of psychological torture. His wife, 3 children aged 6, 9, and 12, his elderly parents, and even his infant grandchild were brought to witness his flaying. The executioners took their time, ensuring the process lasted nearly 5 hours. Al-Tabari's 6-year-old son began screaming for his father within the first hour and didn't stop until his voice gave out completely. His wife tried to throw herself from the viewing platform, but was restrained and forced to watch until the very end. The psychological damage was so severe that 2 of his children never spoke again. But the caliphs weren't satisfied with just forcing families to watch. They created elaborate rituals around the witnessing. Family members were required to thank the caliph for the lesson they were receiving. They had to publicly declare that their relative deserved their fate and promise to serve the caliphate more faithfully in the future. Refusing to participate in these declarations would result in additional family members being condemned to the same fate. The most chilling aspect was how children were specifically targeted during these sessions. Court records show that child witnesses were questioned afterward about what they had learned. Those who couldn't properly articulate the lesson were subjected to additional psychological conditioning. Some were forced to help clean up the execution chamber, handling their parents' skin and blood as part of their education. Young children who witnessed flayings often developed what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. Many stopped eating, stopped speaking, or developed violent behavioral problems. But the caliphs saw this as success, not failure. Traumatized children would grow up to be adults who would never dare challenge the state. The witnessing requirement extended beyond immediate family. Neighbors, business partners, and even casual acquaintances were sometimes forced to attend, creating a web of terror that extended throughout entire communities. The message was clear. Everyone was connected, and everyone was vulnerable. But after the horrific death and the traumatic witnessing, the families thought their ordeal was over. They had no idea that the caliph had permanent plans for their loved ones' remains. Death wasn't the end of the horror. It was just the beginning of a public exhibition designed to remind everyone in Baghdad exactly what happened to enemies of the Caliphate. The skinned corpses weren't buried or burned. They were displayed in the city's main square for weeks, sometimes months, as rotting monuments to the caliph's absolute power. The display process was as calculated as the execution itself. The flayed bodies were mounted on specially constructed iron frames that held them upright in lifelike poses. Some were positioned as if they were walking, others appeared to be reaching out to passers-by. The effect was horrifying. Citizens going about their daily business would encounter these skinless figures that looked almost alive but were clearly dead. Caliph Harun al-Rashid, famous in Western culture as a character in the Arabian Nights, was particularly creative with his corpse displays. He ordered that flayed bodies be dressed in the clothes they wore while committing their crimes. Tax collectors who had embezzled money were displayed wearing their official robes. Military officers who had shown cowardice were mounted in full battle armor. The contrast between the formal clothing and the skinless, rotting flesh underneath created an image so disturbing that many citizens would take elaborate detours to avoid the main square. The bodies were treated with preservative chemicals to slow decomposition, but they weren't preserved well enough to prevent the natural process of decay. This was intentional. The caliphs wanted people to witness every stage of human decomposition. Fresh corpses would gradually turn black, then green, as gases built up inside the body cavities. The smell became so overwhelming that vendors in nearby markets had to abandon their stalls. What made this even more grotesque was the wildlife that the displays attracted. Baghdad's population of carrion birds learned that the main square was a reliable food source. Ravens, crows, and vultures would perch on the iron frames, tearing small pieces of flesh from the corpses while citizens tried to go about their daily business. Wild dogs would gather beneath the displays, fighting over scraps of rotting meat that fell to the ground. The psychological impact on the city's population was devastating. Children developed phobias about going to market. Adults began suffering from what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, constantly worried that they might inadvertently do something that would result in their own bodies joining the display. The entire social fabric of Baghdad was warped around the presence of these rotting reminders of state power. But the displays served another purpose beyond intimidation. They were a form of public education. Citizens were expected to bring their children to view the corpses and explain what crimes had led to their execution. Parents were required to use the displays as teaching moments about loyalty and obedience to the Caliphate. Failure to properly educate children using the corpse displays could itself be considered a form of sedition. The most disturbing accounts describe how normalized this horror became. After months of exposure to rotting corpses in their city center, many citizens became desensitized to the sight. Children would play games around the displays, daring each other to touch the iron frames. Merchants would give directions using the corpses as landmarks, turn left at the tax collector's body, then walk past the traitor in blue robes. The bodies were finally removed only when they had decomposed to the point of becoming skeletal remains. But even then, the horror wasn't over. The caliphs had found a use for the bones that would ensure their warning would last for generations. When the public displays finally decomposed beyond recognition, most people assumed the nightmare was over. They were wrong. The Abbasid caliphs had developed an elaborate preservation system that transformed the skeletal remains into permanent monuments to their cruelty, hidden away in secret chambers beneath the palace where the horror could continue indefinitely. The bone preservation process was overseen by a specialized group of court officials, known as the Keepers of Memory. These weren't just servants or executioners. They were scholars, historians, and artists who had been tasked with creating a permanent record of the Caliphate's enemies. Every skeleton was carefully cleaned, treated with preservative salts, and arranged in poses that reflected the condemned person's crime. The preservation chambers stretched for hundreds of feet beneath Baghdad's royal palace. Stone corridors lined with niches, each containing the complete skeleton of someone who had crossed the Caliphate. But these weren't anonymous remains. Each skeleton was accompanied by detailed bronze plaques describing the person's name, crime, social status, family members, and the specific method of their execution. The plaques were written in multiple languages to ensure that foreign visitors could understand the warnings. Caliph al-Ma'mun turned the bone chambers into a grotesque museum of deterrence. When foreign ambassadors arrived in Baghdad, they were given mandatory tours of the preservation chambers as part of their diplomatic orientation. Imagine walking through corridor after corridor of human skeletons, each representing someone who had dared to oppose the Abbasid Caliphate, while your host calmly explained the political lessons each death was meant to teach. The most disturbing aspect was how the skeletons were posed. Tax evaders were arranged reaching toward piles of gold coins that had been placed just out of their grasp. Military deserters were positioned as if they were running away, their leg bones extended mid-stride. Religious dissidents were posed in prayer positions, their skulls tilted upward toward heaven, a mockery of the faith that had led to their destruction. Children's skeletons were given special treatment. The caliphs understood that the sight of small bones would have maximum psychological impact on visitors. Child skeletons were arranged in family groups, positioned as if they were still playing or embracing their parents. Bronze plaques explained that these children had died because their parents had chosen rebellion over loyalty to the state. The chambers included a special section for members of the caliph's own court, who had been executed for betrayal. These skeletons were dressed in the remnants of their official robes, now rotted and falling apart, but still recognizable. The message was unmistakable. Not even the caliph's closest advisors were safe from his justice. Loyalty was temporary, but the consequences of disloyalty were eternal. What made this even more chilling was the meticulous record-keeping. The keepers of memory maintained detailed catalogues of every skeleton, cross-referenced with the human leather documents that had been made from the same person's skin. Visitors could request to see both the physical remains and the legal documents written on the person's flesh, creating a complete circle of dehumanization. But the preservation chambers held more than just individual skeletons. The caliphs had created something that would horrify even the most hardened observers when it was finally discovered centuries later. In 1987, construction workers renovating the foundation of a government building in Baghdad broke through a stone wall and discovered something that made international headlines for all the wrong reasons. The workers had uncovered the Abbasid preservation chambers, perfectly sealed for over 1,000 years, containing the skeletal remains of more than 2,847 people, arranged in their original poses of eternal warning. The discovery was initially kept secret by Iraqi authorities who understood the international implications of such a find. When archaeologists were finally allowed access to the site, they found something unprecedented in the historical record, a systematic archive of state-sponsored torture and murder that had been preserved like a museum exhibit. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the British archaeologist who led the initial survey team, later described the experience as walking through humanity's worst nightmare made permanent. The preservation had been so effective that many skeletons still retained fragments of clothing, jewelry, and even skin tissue that had been mummified by the salt treatments. Bronze plaques were still legible after a millennium, providing detailed accounts of each person's alleged crimes and methods of execution. But the most disturbing discovery was in the chamber's deepest section, where archaeologists found what they initially thought was a separate burial ground. Closer examination revealed the truth. It was a section devoted entirely to families who had been executed together. Parents and children were arranged in embracing poses, their skeletons positioned to suggest they were comforting each other even in death. The forensic analysis revealed details that confirmed the most horrific aspects of historical accounts. Many of the adult skeletons showed evidence of the systematic knife cuts consistent with flaying. Stress fractures in the bones indicated prolonged torture. Perhaps most disturbing, chemical analysis of the bone marrow revealed that many victims had been kept alive and conscious for hours during their torture, exactly as historical documents had described. The children's skeletons told an even darker story. Many showed signs of malnutrition and disease, suggesting they had been imprisoned and tortured alongside their parents before being executed. Some of the smallest skeletons, belonging to children as young as 4 years old, showed evidence of having been flayed alive using the same techniques applied to adults. The archaeological team also found evidence of the human leather workshop in an adjacent chamber. Tanning tools, vats for chemical treatment, and even fragments of processed human skin were preserved in the dry Baghdad climate. Chemical analysis confirmed that the leather fragments were indeed human, and cross-referencing with the skeletal remains proved that specific individuals had been skinned and their hides processed in the same facility. The international community was horrified, but perhaps more disturbing was the Iraqi government's response. Rather than treating the discovery as a historical atrocity to be studied and remembered, authorities quickly sealed the chambers again, claiming the site was archaeologically insignificant and posed structural dangers to nearby buildings. The official explanation was that the chambers were too expensive to preserve as a historical site. The real reason was more chilling. The discovery proved that systematic state torture and murder weren't modern innovations. They were ancient techniques that had been refined over centuries by regimes that understood how terror could be used to maintain absolute power. Today, the entrance to the preservation chambers is hidden beneath a parking lot in central Baghdad. The skeletons remain in their carefully arranged poses, still wearing their bronze plaques of accusation, still positioned to warn visitors who will never come. The Abbasid caliphs created a monument to their own cruelty that outlasted their empire by 1,000 years, and the modern world has chosen to bury that monument, rather than confront what it reveals about the human capacity for systematic evil. The flaying chambers of Baghdad prove that the most terrifying aspect of power isn't its capacity for isolated acts of violence. It's the ability to transform cruelty into art, suffering into entertainment, and human beings into objects that can be skinned, tanned, displayed, and preserved for eternity, as warnings to anyone who dares to challenge absolute authority.